Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are starting a new series. This series I'm going to be calling Nonsense Debunked. It's basically where we address different nonsensical statements or arguments regarding Nintendo and debunking them. So today, for the first of hopefully many episodes, we will be countering those who say the Zelda timeline does not exist. But before going forward, let me ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. So the fact of the matter is, the Zelda timeline does exist. They did release an official timeline, and they have since updated upon the timeline over the years. This is just a fact, so to say it doesn't exist is untrue. However, perhaps where the conversation becomes more nuanced is not so much saying that the timeline doesn't exist, but maybe something more along the lines of questioning if Nintendo and the Zelda team even care about the timeline if they put in a proper attention to detail. Because there are certainly many arguments to be made on the timeline placements and what makes sense, and different retcons on different things that happen throughout the continuity of The Legend of Zelda. There are multiple timelines, and that leads to a variety of complications and things that some people just don't think make sense. So then many just like to adopt the strategy of just thinking that Nintendo and the Zelda team don't care. But I also don't agree with this thinking either. However, I will concede that the Zelda timeline is something that appears to be fluid, and that they intentionally leave a lot up for interpretation. With Hyrule Historia, where they first started showing the timeline and depicting the timeline split from Ocarina of Time, there was something that was said in the beginning under this section here where it says Weaving History. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered secrets that still lie within the tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Hyrule's history is a continuously woven tapestry of events. Changes that seem inconsequential, disregarded without even a shrug, could evolve at some point to hatch new legends and perhaps change this tapestry of history itself. And so essentially what's being said there is that the timeline is fluid. There are going to be times where we see a new version of the timeline and something there is unexpected, something shifted or moved around. The Legend of Zelda is, after all, a legend. Each game is telling a tale of a legend. And we look at legends and how they've been told throughout real life. The idea behind them is that they were told by one person, and that story was passed on generation by generation. And so this way of relaying information does offer some level of interpretation and changing of events. So you could argue, by simply looking at the very title of the series, The Legend of Zelda, there's already an implication that how each game connects to the other is either loose or fluid. How we understand these games and how they connect will change over time. So does that mean that the team does not actually care about the timeline, and this is more just like a convenient way of looking at it so they can continue to make games and people will just make their own connections regardless? I think there's some truth in that, but ultimately I still think they care, to a reasonable point. So back in 2018, there were a variety of interviews that were taking place regarding Breath of the Wild. And here in this interview with the series producer Eiji Aonuma, Alex Seedhouse in this article quoted a few things from Aonuma. In books like the recently released The Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia, we revealed where each Zelda game fell on a timeline and how their stories related. But we didn't do that for Breath of the Wild. There is a reason for that. With this game, we saw just how many players were playing in their own way and had those reactions I just mentioned. We realized that people were enjoying imagining the story that emerged from the fragmental imagery we were providing. If we defined a restricted timeline, then there would be a definitive story, and we would eliminate the room for imagination, which wouldn't be as fun. We want players to be able to continue having fun imagining this world even after they are finished with the game. So, this time, we decided that we would avoid making clarifications. I hope that everyone can find their own answer in their own way. And so here, the producer of the series is essentially saying that they do care about the timeline, but it's not in the way that many would assume. They care about it because the Zelda fans care about it. We get into it. We have these conversations, these debates, these theories. And so what I take issue with is when people say that Nintendo or the Zelda team don't care and they put no effort into it. They do. They put thought into it because us, the Zelda fans, put thought into it. And the way they structured Breath of the Wild was in a way to allow us to continue to have these debates and conversations. There was reason behind not telling us exactly where Breath of the Wild takes place. All we know is it takes place far into the future. Because the way Breath of the Wild was designed was a game designed for you to play it in your own way and have your own adventure, and that's the way they decided to go. But how about with the follow-up, Tears of the Kingdom? Well, taking a look at this Game Informer interview from December of 2023 written by Brian Shea, there were some interesting things said by both Eiji Aonuma and also the director of the series, Hidemaru Fujibayashi. So here it was asked, when you're developing a new Zelda title, obviously your primary focus is on core gameplay. But the timeline placement discussion has become more important and prevalent among the fans of the series. How much consideration and importance does the development team put into those discussions? Hidemaru Fujibayashi. As you mentioned, we realize that fans have a great time theorizing and enjoy thinking about where things fit on the timeline. That's something that the development team recognizes and it considers, but to an extent. And I say to an extent because if we get too into the weeds or too detailed in that placement, it results in kind of creating restraints for our creativity. The process of creating new ideas becomes restricted because we're so tied up and trying to make this fit into a very specific spot in the timeline. We do consider it, but not to an extent where we feel that our development process feels restricted or constrained. So literally right there, the director of the series says that they do consider it. It is part of the equation, but not so much so that it takes away from their own creative decisions on what they want to do with the game. But let's also read what Aonuma said. Another point kind of related to this is that we've been able to realize more fully a real working world because of technology. You are also able to fine-tune all the details of that world. But we don't always want to do that just because we now can. Instead, as people play the game, we want to give them the ability to exist in that world and a world that they can interpret in their own way. And so, that's also something that we really keep in mind as we're continuing to develop games. So essentially what's going on here is that the Zelda team does care. They do put in details, they do think and plan around the timeline. But only to an extent. They won't go so far as changing the gameplay direction of the game to make the timelines fit. It goes the other way around. And that's where that fluidity of the timeline may come into play. The timeline will adapt somewhat as they make different games. There's not always going to be a perfect fit. But when you take into consideration that this is a series called The Legend of Zelda, these are about different legends, and when we're talking about different legends, how they connect and how they are told, there is flexibility there. But then also on top of that, Aonuma discusses how with the more recent games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the way we go about playing these games, there's a great deal of choice. And the adventure is what we make it. And so they've also started to design the game, the story, and even depictions of the timeline in a way where we can come to our own conclusions on how different elements connect. Which is why they have not given us an exact answer on if the founding of Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom is the original founding or a new founding. And it's also why we don't know where Breath and Tears take place in the timeline in terms of the timeline splits. All we know is they take place far, far late into the timeline. So to say that the Zelda timeline doesn't exist is not true. But if you want to say that you don't care to engage in the argument about the timeline because it's so fluid, because it's left for so much interpretation, then that's fine. But for those who want to engage in the conversation, they're totally entitled to. The Zelda team makes these games with that in mind. They are very much aware that a big part of the Zelda fan base engages in these debates and trying to make these connections, and they will continue to serve that while also delivering the best possible games they can. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.